Hello again, and welcome back to part 3 of our video series on the introduction to World War II. Today, as the title describes, we're going to be talking about the Battle of Britain, Germany's attempt at knocking Great Britain out of the war, and then we're going to be discussing Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union. So the goals for today are that we'd like you to identify the Battle of Britain, understand kind of the key details of that conflict, and then we're going to be introducing Operation Barbarossa, which was the name given for the Nazi plan to invade the Soviet Union. So I'd like you to identify some of the key details of both of those parts of the war. Then we'd like to describe the roles of industrialism, specifically British industrialism, and then nationalism, again, specifically British nationalism, and how those two trends were able to kind of defeat the Nazis in the Battle of Britain. And finally, over the course of this video, we would like to think about how some events could potentially be seen as crimes. The Nazis are going to commit many atrocities throughout the course of the war, and we will see some instances of those atrocities here in this video with regard to Britain and definitely with regard to their treatment of people in Eastern Europe and into the Soviet Union. So again, looking at the two terms, Battle of Britain, Operation Barbarossa, industrialism and nationalism in Great Britain, and then potential war crimes by Germany. So when we last left, we were looking at how the Nazis had invaded the Low Countries of Belgium and the Netherlands, and they were able to position their army in such a way that they had surrounded the British Expeditionary Force in northern France on the beaches of Dunkirk. So from there, the British were able to rescue over 300,000 British and French troops and bring them safely home to the British mainland. However, France did fall to Nazi Germany with the puppet state of the Vichy government in the south that was indirectly controlled by the German government. So here is where Europe stood in 1940 before there was any direct major attacks on British soil. Now, the first portion of this video, we're going to look at a very important geographic area, which was the English Channel. So if we look at a satellite view of the channel, you see it's just so very close, yet so far away. So at its closest point in the Strait of Dover, here's Dover, England, and here's Calais in France. This is a mere 20 miles. Now, the Nazi army would chew up 20 miles of, land conquest very easily, right? They had troops. Here they are marching into Paris, super organized, a very efficient fighting force. They were highly mechanized, very mobile, very fast. These tanks would barge into countries. They would decimate, whole populations. Yet, the massive power of the Nazi army was their speed of land invasions was negated by this small strip of water that was the English Channel. So what we're going to do is talk about how that really changes the course of the war. Here we see a map of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis' plan to invade England with their troops. So they called this Operation Sea Lion. This was the plan to load the Nazi fighting force, trucks, tanks, troops, vehicles, onto amphibious landing crafts, and then sail them across the English Channel and land them on the beaches of southern England. And from there, they were going to move inland with their army, conquer London, conquer some of the major cities. They were also going to drop paratroopers in. This was the plan. The Nazis never actually execute this plan, and we're going to get into one of the major reasons why. Them being unable to directly invade was an incredible advantage for the British, and it really kind of turns the tide of the entire war. And though the Nazis might not have realized it at the time, their inability to invade the British mainland is really going to spell their doom a few years later. And one of the major reasons why Operation Sea Lion and a land invasion would have been difficult is ships like this were required to bring the troops across the channel. This was a troop transport ship controlled by the Nazis, and these were very slow-moving vehicles. They're big targets for the British Navy. And so these ships would have been needed in large quantities to bring the soldiers across the channels to successfully invade the country. And that was going to be very difficult, especially because the British Navy was arguably the best in the world. They had ships like this, like cruisers that were very fast, that had guns on them. They had big turrets, they had cannons. They could they were much more agile, and then there were large battleships which had very big cannons on them. They could destroy a troop transport ship from far away. Britain it's a giant island. Their strength is in their navy. It has been, and so Germany knows this. Germany knows that they aren't going to be able to just take their troop transports right across without being stopped. So if you're Hitler and you'd like to storm the beaches of England and conquer the island or put down the British as a threat, what can you do, right? If you can't just launch your soldiers across easily. And what they were going to do is use planes and bombers. And so over the course of 1940 and 1941, the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, bombs Britain, just repeatedly and relentlessly bombs Britain. Their goal here is to knock out the supply lines to the British Navy, hopefully actually destroy some of the ships that are being built or that are docked on shore. What this would do is one of two things. Maybe the British are so wounded and so demoralized that they surrender to the Nazis, and then Hitler doesn't actually have to worry about Great Britain at all. They sign a peace treaty. The British give up some of their land. They don't fight the Nazis, and then the Nazis can go on and conquer other parts of Europe. The second thing that this could do is just weaken the British. So even if they did choose to fight, their navy would be weak, their cities would be weak, their fighting force would be weak, and then the Nazis could carry out the invasion at a later point. And the Germans had a massive advantage in the air. Their advantage in the ocean was non-existent, but their advantage in the air was pretty significant. And the British really just had 600 single and double-seater fighter planes to fight off the almost 2,000 Nazi planes. Here are examples of German bombers, these pretty large planes that could drop bombs onto cities, onto ships, onto docks, onto all things like that. Here they are flying across the English Channel. I think this is an interesting picture. You see the crests of the waves here as a squadron of bombers just rolls across the channel heading towards England. An aerial view of German bombers bombing directly onto London. Here is the city of Plymouth. Plymouth was a very important city, a very large naval dockyard. And here you see just a big plume of smoke as the Germans are bombing the dockyards. This was the intent to knock out the German Navy so that they could not fortify the English Channel. You see here behind the silhouette is the fires that are raging in London as the Germans drop incendiary bombs, basically bombs designed to light things on fire all across London. And then just the utter destruction that was wrought by the German Air Force. Now the bombing, which is referred to by the British as the Blitz, lasted for months and months on end. And in the late fall of 1940, there was about 60 days straight where the Nazis were bombing England and then bombing London. Just every single night, there would be bombs dropping all over the city, destroying it. And here is really the key point of the war. The British people never wavered in their determination to fight off the Nazis. They never lost hope. So here you see people hiding underground, in subway tunnels, in bunkers, in caves, in basements, things like that. And there's even a few people here smiling. It was this positivity that allowed the British government to continue fighting and to continue, holding off the Nazis. And it really forces the Nazis to throw more and more resources at the attack on Britain. And this, I think, is just a great picture, good British sarcasm right here. You see a totally destroyed storefront and then a guy writing on here, business as usual. This is really kind of almost a defiant look at the Nazi Luftwaffe. Like, we're going to continue on, we're going to keep fighting. Here again is another image of British people on Christmas hunkering down, looking positive. And this show of nationalism and this show of support for the British cause makes it incredibly difficult for the Nazis to be successful in their bombing campaign. Their bombing campaign was intended to basically knock the British out of the war, and you see here that they're just not willing to go down so easily. This, I think, is a great picture. This is, at the time, Princess Elizabeth giving a speech to the country at the age of 14. She would go on to be the current Queen of England. And so in this moment, the British people are rallying. They're rallying around their community, their culture. They're rallying around, their endurance to defeat the Nazis. The bombing here was intended to knock them out, and it really is unsuccessful because the British were so determined to not give up. But there was another more logistical reason why the Nazis struggled to defeat the British in this battle. Part of it is because the Nazis are flying over home soil of Britain, right? And the Nazis are far away from their own access to resources and supplies. So you look here, this is the British Spitfire. This was their best plane that they used to fight off the Nazis in the air. And this was a very nimble plane in the air. It was much more maneuverable than any of the planes that the Nazis had. The other advantage that the British had was if one of their planes was hit, the pilot could eject and he could land back on British soil. He, brush him off and get him right back into another plane, and then he's up and fighting again. Whereas the Nazi Air Force, if one of their pilots was shot down and he ejected, he's likely to land in the English Channel and probably drown, or he's going to land on British soil and he's going to be captured and taken as a prisoner. Another major advantage that the British had was Churchill commits the entire might of British society and manufacturing to build airplanes. And he says, if we're going to win this battle, if we're going to continue on fighting the Nazis and hopefully defeating them at some later date, we need to survive now, and we need an air force. Late in 1940 and into 1941, they are basically replacing every single plane that gets shot down and then some, right? They're building more planes than they're losing. They actually get to a point where they have too many planes and not enough trained pilots to fly those planes. So the British whole manufacturing base just is devoted to the cause of making airplanes. And then another major advantage that the British had was this sophisticated system of radar and communication. So as soon as Nazi aircraft would cross a channel, they would almost immediately be detected by the radar of the British. But on top of that, there were lookout points all across southern England. So the Nazi planes would be detected by radar, they would be noticed by the lookout points, and all of that information would be relayed back to the Royal Air Force bases. So the planes could be launched, gotten up into the sky, and then they would be immediately fighting the Nazi planes before they could really do significant damage. So the big struggle here was the Nazis never really had, a constant free reign attack on England. Did the Luftwaffe do incredible damage across British cities? Absolutely. But the British are making it very, very difficult for them. And again, if you're fighting on your home turf, you just need to make it difficult. And for the Nazis, this was incredibly difficult. It was really in this moment that the course of the war shifted. Because the British were able to fight off the Nazis and hold them off, the Nazi kind of war machine had to turn its attention elsewhere. And that really becomes a large problem for the Nazis, is because they don't knock out the British. So you could say that Britain winning, or rather not losing, the battle allows them to fight on and get stronger and eventually defeat the Nazis. Between July 10th and October 31st of 1940, Britain lost 792 aircraft and Germany lost 1,389. In the whole course of the battle, almost 3,000 Royal Air Force aircrew were involved. 507 were killed and 500 were wounded. I think this is so interesting because the Nazis started off with a 3-1 advantage in terms of airplanes in the sky. And over the course of the battle, Britain is able to destroy almost double the amount that the Germans could. These figures justify Churchill's famous remark: "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." And I think Churchill probably intended for the quote to mean that so many British people and people in Europe owed their survival to the brave people who fought in the skies in the Battle of Britain. But I think we could expand that quote even further. The few in this case I really look at as the entire British population and their determination to stay positive and to stay working and to stay fighting against the most dire of odds. Had the British population given up, had the government given up, had their air force given up, the Nazis probably would have been able to conquer England, maybe invaded and knocked out the British and knocked out the British Empire. Had they done that, World War II turns out very differently. I think when Churchill says, so much was owed by so many to so few, we really might look at that as the world owes its survival and owes the defeat of the Nazis to the few people of Great Britain who endured, really, really terrible odds. Because after this, the tide of the war starts to turn, though it doesn't look like it at first. The Nazis are going to rampage throughout Eastern Europe. But what Britain is able to do is they're now able to use their navy and fight the Nazis and fight the Italians all across the Northern Atlantic, the Mid-Atlantic Ocean. They're able to fight them in the Western Mediterranean and all across the Mediterranean Sea. This is going to put a lot of pressure on the Nazis. It's going to make it very difficult for them to move resources around. It's going to make life incredibly difficult for the Italians. And what it does is it sends a clear message to the American government. The British are willing to fight and they're willing to do what it takes to defeat the Nazis. And we as Americans, we need to support them in this cause. So after Britain is able to fight off the Nazis, President Roosevelt convinces Congress that now is the time to get involved. Now is the time to help our allies, the British, as they fight the most insurmountable of foes. The United States Congress passes what's called the Lend-Lease Act. And this program allows the United States to deliver resources and war materials to the Allied powers. Here you see a naval dockyard in Philadelphia of World War I ships that are going to be repurposed and refurbished and delivered to the Allied powers to defeat the Nazis. President Roosevelt in this moment declares that the United States is going to be involved in building and supplying the arsenal of democracy. So the United States gets involved in the war because they see the determination of Britain to defeat the Nazis. The British then start to move troops into strategic locations. They unload their forces in Egypt, getting ready to fight the Italians and the Nazis in North Africa. Here's a great picture, I think, of an Indian regiment in Egypt fighting for the British against the Italians, right? This really shows us that this is becoming a world war, and the British Empire is being used to defeat the Nazi power. The Nazis then unload their troops in Libya, led by Rommel, who we'll get into later with the North African campaign. The fighting is going to continue, but the British have shown that they have a chance. After this, the Nazis move away from Britain and they conquer the Balkan area very quickly, right? They take over Yugoslavia and Romania and Bulgaria and Greece and all that. So Hitler now is faced with a predicament. He has the British kind of now encircling the Mediterranean, encircling the Atlantic Ocean, and they're now being supplied by the United States. And he also has this constant desire for a conflict with the Soviet Union. We talked about it in the past. He saw them, a bunch of communists, they're Slavic people. He views that this land in this area should be rightfully German, and what he views as what he calls Lebensraum, as the German living space. He also sees up in the north where Finland is able to successfully repel the Soviet Union, and he's able to build a partnership with them. And so now Hitler is looking at, I have this large country here, the Soviet Union. They are not a very technologically advanced army. They are not super organized. I have the British over here that don't have a very big army, but they're getting stronger by the month and by the year because of their supply from the United States. So Hitler almost goes through what we might think of as a reverse Schlieffen plan from World War One. Now, back in World War One, Germany felt that it was necessary to take out France and Britain first, and then Germany was going to go take out the Soviet Union. That was World War One. Here in World War II, it's almost the opposite. Germany looks at the Soviet Union as currently its big threat here in the East, right? It's got troops and soldiers and land claims right up along this new German border. And Britain and the United States are getting stronger, but they're not as formidable yet, right? Hitler views the United States and Great Britain as a potential threat down the road, but one that he doesn't need to worry about right now. The bigger threat he sees is the Soviet Union, and he really sees this as a threat because he views this land as land that should be occupied by Germans. These people, he thinks, should not be in control of this land. He doesn't respect them as humans. So Hitler offers to Stalin, he offers him an agreement, kind of an extension of the Molotov-Ribbentrop agreement. He would like to take this land from the Soviet Union, and he'd like to install Germans living there. The Soviets respond to that with a plan of their own to basically claim much of the Balkans, Finland, even more territory in the Baltic regions, parts of Poland, and this really offends Hitler. Hitler looks at this as, you know what, I can't work with these people. We need to immediately go to war. We need to crush them. So when it's clear that Stalin is not willing to negotiate for the land, Hitler kind of loses his mind and says, all right, we must destroy them. What happens next is probably the most significant part of World War II, and arguably one of the most important decisions that was made in the 20th century, and definitely one of the decisions that will echo throughout time. Hitler and the Nazi government plan and execute Operation Barbarossa. This is the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. And I want to get into this a little bit because Operation Barbarossa and the invasion of the Soviet Union is Operation Barbarossa was focused on kind of three major cities in the Soviet Union. The first was Moscow, the capital of the Soviet Union. Hitler wanted to see this destroyed symbolically. The other symbolic city was that of Leningrad, modern-day St. Petersburg. Leningrad, at the strategic location, in terms of its access to the ocean, but also symbolically, the name Lenin was that of the first leader of the Soviet Union, right? The father of Soviet communism. And the Nazis had been able to kind of work with the Finnish government, who was actively fighting against the Soviet Union. And so now they have kind of an advantage here in working against the city of Leningrad. And the final and arguably the most important objective for Hitler was Stalingrad. And this is going to be the site of the worst battle in human history, the highest casualties on either side. And although there were massive oil reserves south of Stalingrad, the name itself, Stalingrad, the namesake of the Soviet leader, it could not be overlooked by Hitler. He needed to take the city. He had to do it. Now, all three of these cities are going to have millions of people in them, and they're all going to be targets of Operation Barbarossa. So the Nazis set out to invade the Soviet Union. They break their non-aggression pact. And these three arrows represent some truly horrific events in human history. The Nazis are going to take millions of people as prisoners of war, and they're going to deport them into labor camps. If I go back here, you're going to actually see the Nazis will be moving through Poland first. So some of the first victims of Operation Barbarossa are going to be Polish people and Polish Jews. Throughout this campaign, the Nazis are going to lay waste to Soviet villages, to Romanian villages, to Polish villages, to villages in the Baltic territories, and they're going to be absolutely ruthless. Just raping and pillaging and murdering as they go. Constant destruction. It's really almost like a scorched earth policy here. And this, I think, is just one of the most interesting pictures of the war. And in a way, this picture represents the downfall of the Nazis without them even realizing it. That man there with the glasses on is Heinrich Himmler. Just a terrible, terrible human being. He was one of the major architects of the Holocaust. Now, Heinrich Himmler is staring at a Soviet prisoner of war. And I love the defiant look on his face as he just stares directly into the eyes of a genocidal leader of the Nazi regime. This defiance by the Soviet Union is going to be the downfall of the Nazis. In the same way that the British were defiant and the British kind of came together as a nation, the Soviet Union is going to do that as well. Now, the Soviet Union is going to face atrocities that are unimaginable, but they are going to stand up nonetheless. They're going to come together as a country, and they're going to fight back against the Nazis. So this right here is really the downfall of the Nazi regime, and they don't even know it yet. Here you see another picture of thousands of Soviet prisoners of war that are going to be taken and deported to Nazi slave labor camps. Again, when we think back to our goals for this video, one of the goals was to think about, could certain actions be potential crimes? Now, I think here, deporting millions of people, captured prisoners of war, women, children, soldiers, deporting them into Poland and Germany to be used as slave labor, by my standards, that might be seen as unethical, as potentially a crime, maybe a war crime, maybe even as a crime against humanity, where you're taking these people on train cars and just sending them like cattle back into Germany to be used as slaves to make resources for the Nazi army. At its height, this is really what the Nazi Empire is going to look like. They're able to take Stalingrad. They kind of stop short on the edge of Moscow, and they encircle Leningrad. They lay siege around the city. Now, in a later video, we're going to get into what these three battles looked like. So here we see the Nazis really at the height of their conquest, right? And this is one of the most successful military campaigns of the war up until this point, right? The Nazis are highly trained, very effective, and they conquer a huge portion of territory. After this, the tide of the conflict is going to change, and it really starts in the final month of 1941. In a small naval base in the territory of Hawaii on the other side of the world, the Empire of Japan is going to launch a surprise attack on the U.S. Navy. That attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7th of 1941, is going to bring the United States into the war. With the U.S. entry into the war, Operation Barbarossa has clearly failed. The Nazis were unable to completely defeat the Soviet Union before the United States entered the war. Because a month later, in January of 1942, American troops land in Northern Ireland. And now the U.S., the major superpower left in the world, has entered the war and is now bringing troops into the European conflict. This is going to be a disaster for the Nazis, though not immediately. There will be significant fighting and untold death and destruction yet to come, but the Nazis have sealed their fate. So if we go back to the goals of the video, right, we wanted to talk about the Battle of Britain, which we did. Hopefully you were able to identify that, and Operation Barbarossa, the Nazi plan to invade the Soviet Union. Now, looking at the roles of nationalism and industrialism, we were able to see how the British could fight off the Nazi attempted invasion. And then we looked at some potential crimes committed by the Germans. The bombing of cities and towns in London, the absolute destruction in Eastern Europe, all of these we might see as potential war crimes. We're going to be moving over to the Pacific Theater in our next video, and we will return later on with the end of the war in Europe. Look forward to seeing you then. Take care.